Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Steven Salazar. I'm a program manager in the Microsoft Identity team. So welcome to today's event. This is the fifth week on the 5-week B2C webinar series. Today, we're joined by John Garland, who's a partner, MVP, MCT, great partner of ours, who's going to be presenting today on the topic of troubleshooting custom policies. And we'll also have Vinu Gunasekaran and Phil Whips, two program managers who are going to be helping us answer questions during the session that we have covered during the last 4 weeks and this week as well. All of these sessions have been recorded, and I already posted the link to where you can find the recordings for all the sessions in the chat window, in the live Q&A window. So again, just before I give it to John, please take the time at the end of the session to fill out the post-event survey. That will help us understand if you'd like to see more content from us. So without further ado, I'm going to let John get started. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. As Stephen said, my name is John Garland, and I'm the Vice President for Cloud Development at WinElect. We've been an award-winning Microsoft partner for many years, with a focus on both consulting and training in Azure, as well as other Microsoft and related technologies. I myself am a Microsoft Azure MVP, a certified trainer, and an instructor at WinElect. In fact, I teach a course that WinElect offers to help our partners learn how to effectively use Azure AD B2C. I've also written some extensive posts covering Azure AD B2C. You can find out more about me and WinElect and see the content that I've written at winelect.com, and I also tweet at the .NET Gator alias. Also on the call with me today are, as Stephen mentioned, Vinu Gunasekaran and Phil Whips from Microsoft to handle Q&A. They're both Azure AD B2C program managers. This session is part of the Azure AD B2C webinar series covering identity protocols and Azure AD B2C custom policy deep dives. Up to this point in the series, we've reviewed the modern identity protocols that are supported by Azure AD B2C policies and user flows. We've seen how you can integrate Azure AD B2C into your applications using the libraries that support these protocols. And we've also discussed the components that make up Azure AD B2C custom policies, and we've walked through the process of building a custom policy to accomplish a real-world scenario. In this session, we're going to take a look at how to proceed when things aren't quite so prescriptive, and examine tools and techniques you can use to design and troubleshoot, and basically to get your policies right. So thank you for joining us today, and we're really excited that you're here. In today's session, we're going to discuss tools and techniques that you can use to help you create custom policies that meet your needs. We're going to go pretty much through the whole custom policy life cycle, looking at different phases like design. So how can you get from requirements to custom policy, and what prior content is available for you to consume? Development, what tools can you use to help you actually author your policies? Publishing, you're going to need to get your policies into your different environments like dev, test, staging, and production, and so forth. How can you make your policies DevOps friendly? Runtime, how can you make sure your policy logic is working as you intended? And if there are problems, what can you do to detect and correct them? And integration, with your custom policies ready to go, how do you make sure the applications that will be using them are working correctly? As has been the case with the previous sessions in this series, today's content does assume you're familiar with the prerequisite material that's outlined in the session description. This includes an understanding of what Azure AD B2C is, knowing how to do basic configuration and end user flow creation using Azure AD B2C, and understanding basic Azure AD B2C use cases. Also, if you haven't seen the videos, the previous sessions in this series, you may want to go back and check the recordings in order to supplement what we're going to be going over today. Okay, let's get started. The first tool to discuss is the Azure AD B2C Visual Studio Code extension. Adding this extension to the Visual Studio Code Editor helps you create, navigate, deploy, and troubleshoot Azure AD B2C custom policies. You can get this extension from the Visual Studio Marketplace or directly from within Visual Studio Code. Now, if we open up Visual Studio Code, which I just happen to have opened up over here, to get an extension, you come over to the little cube puzzle piece here, and you can type in B2C to bring up the B2C extension. Go ahead and select it and click install. And that will go ahead and add it to your Visual Studio Code editor. There are a variety of instructions included in this. We're going to be going over and covering several of the extension's features throughout this session. So let's start with the discussion about design time. There are several tools available to you that you can use to help you with your initial policy design. First and foremost, you need to be aware of the Azure AD B2C documentation resources, and in particular, the custom policy sections. So let me show you how to get there, or at least how I go about getting there. Found it's a real handy way to get documentation on things related to Azure. If you go to docs.microsoft.com/Azure, that'll bring up a view that's very similar to the Azure portal in terms of a breakdown of the various services. Select Identity, and then select Azure Active Directory B2C. Now this is the documentation for the entirety of the Azure AD B2C surface area. For custom policies, we can find those down here in the How-To Guide section and select Custom Policy. You'll see there are a variety of general how-to references. For example, opening up UX customization, custom email. This would be instructions for how to use SendGrid to generate emails out of your custom policies. Also, you can come on down here to the reference section, and this will give you a detailed API reference for the components that will make up your custom policies. Opening up building blocks, I can come down to claims transformations, string transformations, and I can see here I've got the various transformations that are listed, the inputs and outputs that they require, and descriptions of their functionality, and even some examples that you can go ahead and leverage in terms of bringing this into your policy. So you want to accomplish something. How do I get it in my policy? We can always come back to the docs, and there's a rich documentation in here that you can look up and use as a reference to build your policies. In addition to the API reference and the examples in the official documentation, the Azure AD B2C team also maintains a repository that includes an extensive set of policy examples. This is extremely helpful because a lot of common scenarios that you may need to implement have been included and documented in this repository. There's no sense reinventing the wheel and making the mistakes and all that. Use what somebody else has learned in order to help you design your policies properly. Referencing this content is going to allow you to take advantage of that work that's already been done, and it eliminates a lot of the exploration or prototype POC work you might otherwise have to do to figure out some of the basic facets that need to be included in your policies. Let's take a trip over to the website and take a look at it. So bringing up the GitHub repository for it, you'll see it's documented throughout the body of the main page. You've got various examples of the kinds of policies that are in here. In fact, I can do search and search for something like password, and I'll see a variety of different things related to passwords, invitations. So I can see examples of different kinds of policies that might help me out. In fact, if I go into the policies folder here and I select, I am looking for profile, you'll see the progressive profile policy that was the subject of the lab that was reviewed in the previous example in this series has been published into this site, and you can see the policy in here and information about the policy. So a real rich resource for getting at things that have already been done. Usually what will happen is your custom policies will need to include some combination of things that you can find in here. Moving out of design and into development, eventually you're going to have to get your hands dirty and get in and code up your custom policies. And this is where we start to see how the Azure AD B2C Visual Studio Code extension helps us out. This extension includes a Policy Explorer panel that lets you see the different declarations in the policy file that is currently open. It includes right-click navigation support. You can click on an item reference and see its declaration and go to its definition, and hover help support as well. So let's go on over into Visual Studio Code. If we look at the profile that we built last week, go ahead and open it up in Visual Studio Code. And let's go on up to the base file. And in just a second, the B2C extension should light up. There we go. And there we have our Policy Explorer. And we can see the various facets that make up this particular policy. There we go. If I select user journeys and go to sign up or sign in, I can see that I've got my second step is this local account sign up with logon email technical profile. If I go to its definition, I'll navigate straight to it. Maybe I'm interested in the object ID claim, so I'll go to its definition, and I can just navigate to the various definitions that make up the bulk of my policy. In addition, if I hover over the claim type and I click on the claims definition link, sure enough, it'll take me right to the docs.microsoft.com documentation for that particular element. So real helpful in terms of being able to navigate and go, see what's going on inside of your policy files. In addition to helping you get around your policies, the Azure AD B2C Visual Studio Code extension helps you to actually write them. It includes autocomplete support to help you with your context-aware options for what elements and values you can include. And it also includes several macros you can use to quickly configure common policy elements. So going back into Visual Studio Code here, let's go into this file, a little more room to work with. If I go ahead and start opening my syntax, okay, I see these are my options. Let's go to claims providers and go ahead and close that. And then go ahead and see my option within a claims providers is a claim provider element, and so on and so forth. So it really helps you know what you're going to be able to type, what you're going to be able to include at a given point inside of your policy file. The other thing you can do is you can bring up the command palette in Visual Studio Code and type in B2C and see the available commands for you here, one of which is add a claim type. So let's add a new claim type. I'll go ahead and select it as it's going to be rendered to the user interface with a text box. I'll give it a name, just call it demo claim for right now. And some display text. This is being used for a demo. And sure enough, it's dropped in the formatted claim declaration into my policy file here for that new claim. So in addition to using the docs to find out how to configure the elements and use the samples contained in the docs, you can also use the IntelliSense built in and the macros built in here to Visual Studio Code extension to help you with creating those syntactically correct policy definitions. So moving out of development time, now that you've assembled your policies, you may need to deploy them across several different different environments. The problem is, generally, you want to separate your environments so that each one has its own distinct Azure AD B2C tenant. And policy files are scoped to a given Azure AD B2C tenant in several ways. The tenant ID is included in the trust framework policy and public policy URI elements of each policy file, and likely is also included in the base policy declaration for any dependent files. Also, as you saw in the previous session in this series, policy files generally include IDs that are used for logging into local accounts or for using custom claims. Those IDs are also usually specific to a given Azure AD B2C instance. And if your policy uses RESTful technical profiles to call HTTP endpoints, the URL that the policy uses is also sometimes scoped per environment. This is a bit of a problem when it comes to having DevOps-friendly policies that can easily be published to each one of your environment rings. To help with this, the Azure AD B2C Visual Studio Code extension includes tooling to help you parameterize your policy files and can generate environment-scoped files from these parameterized templates. So let's take a look at our policy declaration in Visual Studio Code here, and you'll see, we've got our tenant name as part of the tenant ID and as part of the public policy URI, and over here in the base policy declaration. And if I come on up to my extensions file as well, I'll see I've got these IDs that reference applications that are declared inside of my tenant. This is very much scoped to that particular tenant. But if I come over here and open a different policy file, that I prepared ahead of time here, you'll see I can include some substitutions. What I can do is I can use this curly bracket syntax, settings, value, and I can put in placeholders that will allow me to use the B2C extension to create per environment policies. So I've done it for my tenant name. I've also done it for my REST endpoint. If I come up here to my extension file, you'll see I've done it for the various application settings. And I can add this app settings JSON file, which is broken down into several different environments. In this case, my production environment, I've got my production tenant name. Presumably, I would have different tenant names for each of my environments. I've got different application IDs for each of them and a different subdomain for my HTTP endpoints. Coming back into my policy file, if I bring up the command palette here, I can use the B2C policy build command. And what that will do is it will generate this environments folder. And in this environments folder, there'll be one subfolder for each environment whose settings I've declared. And for example, looking in production here, if I bring up my sign up or sign in, I see that my values have been substituted on in for me. And I no longer have to worry about later going back and rewriting them or figuring, creating different policies. Now, at this point, you would do this build step on your development box before checking this into source control and include the environment folders in your source control. And then you would have your independent, your DevOps system, Azure DevOps or whatever you're using for your deployment management, pick up for each environment out of those specific folders. The functionality for building hasn't been extracted yet from the Visual Studio Code extension and made into a tool like that you could use inside of the Azure DevOps pipelines. But I know it's a very common request, but just know that for now, you would do this in the development environment, create the build folders, and then include those in source control, and then each environment in source control would pick up its own folder and distribute that way. Okay. So another facet of publishing, you've got your policy files scoped to each environment. The next step would be to automate the deployment of your policies. To do so, the Microsoft Graph API has support for working with the various Azure AD B2C artifacts and resources. In addition to working directly with the Graph APIs, you can also use the Azure AD PowerShell module, which wraps this functionality to script automatic publishing. Be aware, you don't have to use PowerShell. You can actually publish directly to your B2C tenant from Visual Studio Code. The extension includes functionality to do publishing. You can use the Graph APIs directly also. Sometimes PowerShell scripting can be a bit more familiar to DevOps scripting development, so I figured I'd go ahead and show that here. Now, to go ahead and work with those PowerShell scripts, let's go ahead and bring up a terminal. And let's bring up a PowerShell terminal. And I'm going to do a connect dash Azure AD dash tenant Azure AD B2C webinar series on Microsoft.com. Let's see if I got that right. Okay, and it's going to ask me to sign in. And go ahead and sign in with my admin credentials. My B2C. And lo and behold, I've signed into that tenant. And then I can do commands like get Azure ADMS Trust Framework Policy. Get. So this will list all of the policies in my tenant, and I can use these other commands to go ahead and download specific policies, upload policies, or even delete policies that have been uploaded. And like I mentioned, you can also use graph commands directly. There's documentation for how to do that to add publishing to a Azure DevOps pipeline. And I could also go ahead and use the Visual Studio extension, Visual Studio Code extension, sorry, and do that directly from Visual Studio Code. Okay, once the policy files are published, you might want to look at the telemetry information to help spot errors or identify usage trends. To do so, you can integrate your policies with Azure's Application Insights service. Application Insights is an application performance management service that is part of the Azure Monitor telemetry solution. In addition to providing a place where your applications can send log, metric, and event details, it also provides searching, reporting, and analysis features over all that data. There are two ways that your policies can directly integrate with Application Insights. First, you can use user journey logging to collect log information from your running Azure AD B2C policy. Be aware, though, this is only meant to be a development and debugging solution and isn't meant to be used in production. The logs that it collects include sensitive claims information that you will not want to be responsible for storing and securing in a production environment. These logs can also be quite verbose and somewhat cryptic. We'll take a look at some tooling that can help you work with them. Second, you can create and execute technical profiles that send data that you select as custom events to the Azure Application Insights service. This is useful not only for more discrete troubleshooting than the user journey logs, but also to provide usage insights and performance metrics. Let's look at these two approaches in a little more detail. You enable user journey logging in two steps. First, you need to update the Trust Framework policy element to indicate the user journey recorder endpoint and also to declare that your policy is in development mode. Next, you update the relying party section of your file to include a Journey Insights element in its user journey behavior section. In the Journey Insights section, you indicate your telemetry engine. Right now, Application Insights is the only one supported. The instrumentation key for your App Insights instance. Each instance of the Azure Application Insights service includes an instrumentation key value. This value is specified when data is sent to App Insights so that the data being sent is routed to the proper instance of the service. It's sent to your App Insights repository. Developer mode is a performance setting for App Insights. This updates the rate at which telemetry is gathered and emitted to the App Insights service. Normally in production environments, it's batched up a little bit in order to make sure that the service doesn't interrupt your running application. In developer mode, the App Insights tooling isn't really concerned with preventing performance interruptions to the client application as it normally would be, so the telemetry just flows faster to the service, but it's a setting that you generally don't want enabled in a production system. And then client and server enabling speaks to the origins of data being sent to App Insights in a web application. Including client data will add some client-side script to your web pages, which allows tracking page view performance and client-side errors. So let's take a look at the Azure portal here. And if I come over here to my Azure subscription, you'll notice I've got an Azure App Insights instance created already. It has an instrumentation key. I will need this value for my policies. So let's open up a policy that is set to use this and open with code. And you'll see I've got my profile ready to go. I've indicated it's in development mode and that it should use the Application Insights Journey Recorder. And then down here in my relying party section, I've added the Journey Insights information. I've actually included the instrumentation key as one of my app settings here, so I could have different keys per deployment environment. And now this policy is ready to go and generate that information. Let's see. So we can come on over here to Application Insights, and we can see in a previous run that I've done, I can go on to search, and we'll go in last hour. Should be able to give me something. Okay, last 4 hours. There we go. And we'll see, here's some of the telemetry that's generated, the dark green trace. These will be the telemetry messages that journey logging records. It's a bit verbose, like I said, and a bit cryptic. You can also use, but you see there's a lot of information here. You can also use the B2C extension to connect to your App Insights instance, and it will help organize the data that's there. I'll show you this just here in the interest of speed. You can see it'll gather up the telemetry by policy, and then within it, for each individual run where telemetry was collected, it'll group them in one or more user journey steps. And you can go ahead and bring that up there and look at the discrete steps and the amount of telemetry that it's generating there. Okay. Besides journey logging, you can include your own customized Application Insights technical profiles in your user journeys. So when you call the Application Insights technical profile, you also need to specify an instrumentation key. I've already mentioned this. But when you're using the Application Insights technical profile, you also need to include a claim called event name and provide a value that Application Insights will use as the name in the custom event entries that it records. So to do so, you can use the syntax property : name inside of curly braces, and you can use values taken from the claims bag or environment values using the Azure AD B2C custom policy claims resolvers. We haven't really gone over those much in this series, but they're basically a special notation that allow you to retrieve information about your policy's runtime environment. Notice that, similar to the Azure Active Directory technical profile that we showed in the previous session in this series, it's common to use the include technical profile approach and a common base profile with the Application Insights technical profile. This way you can specify the instrumentation key and other App Insights settings in one place. For example, claims that you want to make sure are always emitted to the event no matter what the specific Application Insights gathering is doing. And then the rest of the functionality can be captured inside of each discrete declaration of the technical profile. Let's actually look at that inside of a policy here. So I will come on here to my extensions file, look at my claims providers, App Insights, and you'll see I've got several here. I've got a common one. It includes an instrumentation key declaration. It also includes a few key values. The ID of the policy that's currently being executed is being pulled from the claim resolver. The correlation ID, so we can obtain debug information and report it back. Also decided I wanted to gather the current origination IP address of the request, as well as the client ID that's being sent in the OpenID Connect portion of the request. Then after sign-in, I'm going to want to gather things like the object ID and the display name, and I'll use the default value here to hard code in the name after sign-in. Event name is a claim that I've declared up at the top of the policy here, and it just never gets a value, but by using the default value, I can force it to a particular string. After sign up, I'll also collect the same information. Before update, I'll collect whether or not I have a new user and whether or not I have a loyalty number. And then at the end, after the update, I'll also indicate whether or not I have a loyalty number. So I could use these if I come on down to my user journey. I can see I've sprinkled them in. After the sign in and sign up step where the user signs in, I'll go ahead and add an after sign in request. After the, if they haven't signed in and they're signing up, I'll go ahead and add an after sign up telemetry generation. Likewise, after we read the objects from the local Active Directory tenant, I'll go ahead and use the before update, and so on and so forth. So I've sprinkled these in here, and they'll go ahead and generate log information back to my App Insights instance. In fact, if we go ahead and run our policy here, go into Identity Experience Framework, and let's run our policy from last week. I'm going to sign up a new user. J. Garland, send my verification code. Smith. And let's see if I've got my verification code yet. Yes, and it is 260805. Verify my code, create the user. And we've got our claims. Let's run it again and gather their loyalty number. And we'll do DEF 456. And we'll run it one more time to show that we're not gathering it, that we already have the loyalty card number. And our claims have been gathered. Now, if I come on back here to my App Insights instance, we'll see how quickly the data has gathered. It can take a couple of minutes. We'll come on over here to search. Let's try the last 30 minutes, and if not, I'll just look at an earlier one. Okay, those are the two traces that happened a little bit earlier. Let's see. Now we'll just go back to an earlier run. In the interest of time, I'll skip on back. So I've got one right here that I can examine, and I can see my request started here. I have my after sign-in. Actually, let me use a slightly different one. Started here, after sign-in, and I've got the client ID, the correlation ID, the IP address, no object ID. Okay, so this must be a new user. Come on up, after sign-in. After sign up, I now see that I've got an object ID. I've got a user ID. Before update, new user in this case is set to false, so I must have already signed this user in. And then I lost my place. Before update, and Fred Smith, and yeah, okay. Let me just thin this herd down a little bit here so I can show a little bit better. Let's get rid of all this other noise and just do custom events. There we go. And let's do the last 30, see if these new ones have come in yet. Nope. Okay, so last 4. We'll take a look at those. And again, come back and grab these. 1, 2, 3, 4. So again, this would be the last sequence. The user's already provided a loyalty number. I've got, after sign in, I do have an object ID, so the user must have signed in. After sign up as well, it's not a new user, it is set to false. We already have retrieved the user's loyalty number, and then this is the values that are there at the present at the end of the policy. Okay, so we've seen application insights. In addition to gathering telemetry about the execution of our policies, we can also look at the data that's being stored. Normally, our end user facing applications interact with our Azure AD B2C tenant through our Azure AD B2C user flows or custom policies. These in turn leverage the functionality provided by the Identity Experience Framework to access the tooling that's provided by the Azure AD tenant, including the user information data store, application registrations, and other services. However, Azure AD does provide an additional API endpoint that you can use to interact with the data stored in the tenant via the Microsoft Graph API. Using the Microsoft Graph API endpoints, you can access this data and identify the values that have been stored in your tenant. There are several ways you can work with the Microsoft Graph API. You can issue direct REST calls. There are APIs for several programming languages. There's also the Microsoft Graph Explorer, which provides a web-based GUI that you can use to explore the contents of a graph. There is one challenge with B2C, however, when you're working with the Graph Explorer. The Explorer currently does what's called home realm discovery on the user that signs into it. It will look at the identity of the user account, and that is the directory that it will provide information for. Now, when you created your Azure AD B2C tenant from your Azure subscription, you were working from an account that was part of the Azure AD tenant that was used as that subscription's ID provider, usually something like your company's Azure AD tenant. When your Azure AD B2C instance was created, the user who actually created the tenant was invited as a guest user into the newly created Azure AD B2C instance, and it was made the global admin of that instance. So your admin's credentials, and typically the credentials of any developers from your organization that you similarly invite into your Azure AD B2C instance, they won't work with the Graph Explorer to peek into the contents of the Azure AD B2C directory. So in order to access information for your Azure AD B2C directory in the Graph Explorer, you need to create a user account that is local to the Azure AD B2C tenant itself. Then you can sign in as that user and use the Azure AD Graph Explorer. Let me demonstrate. So click this to open the browser. But if I come back over here into my B2C tenant, you'll see this JMG user. This was the user that was created or invited over and made the global admin of my B2C instance when I first created it. I've also then, though, gone back and created a user, Graph Access user, at Azure AD B2C Webinar Series. So it is local within this particular tenant to go ahead and use to access the Graph Explorer. If let's turn on the preview version of it. If I sign into the Graph Explorer, oh, okay, it reused my credentials from an earlier session. That's great. But it is signed in as that Graph Access user. If I come on to beta and I do a query for users, I should see all the users currently in my tenant. And let's go ahead and search for Fred. So I've got my Fred Smith user, and here's the display name that I created for him, the given name, the surname. You'll also see the identities collection with the user principal name that was generated for him when the user was created, as well as information about where that user came from. It was an email address sign-in. If I was federating with Facebook or Microsoft Outlook accounts or what have you, I would have some slightly different values up and in here. Another thing I want to call your attention to, when you're working with extension properties, remember we talked about them being extension underscore and then the property name and then having the value. When it actually gets written into the graph, it actually includes the ID of the application that's being used to work with extension properties. So if you're using the graph APIs to set extension properties, you need to take that into account when you're writing that particular property value. Or if you're looking for the property value, you need to make sure you're looking for it as extension underscore ID underscore property name. Okay. The final topic to address today is working with and troubleshooting, integrating your Azure AD B2C custom policies or even pre-built user flows with your applications that rely on them for the identity needs. The first two sessions in this series covered the identity protocols and some of the tools that you can use in the Microsoft Identity Platform to help you integrate your applications with your Azure AD B2C tenant. Let's close this session by taking a minute to see how we can troubleshoot our policies integration into our applications, considering these underlying protocols. One of the tools that you will want to use if you experience problems with your policy configuration is to examine the network traffic between your application and the Azure AD B2C policy endpoint. Considering the protocols, look at what's being requested and how. If you're thinking about a web application, use the browser's development tools to examine the network traffic when you make an authentication request. Is the endpoint correct? Does the client ID match a registered application? Is the redirect URI included in the list of URIs listed for that application? And be sure to check for small typos or port designations or things like that. Are you requesting the scopes that you think you need to be? Let's actually come on over here to Visual Studio. There we go. And I'm going to create a new ASP.NET Core web application. Just call it Web Application 1. And I'm going to change the authentication to use individual user accounts from a user store in the cloud. Now, let's go back to our cloud service here. I'm going to need to get the name of my tenant. So it's right up here. I'll go ahead and copy that over. Now I need to create an application to enter this application ID. And to do that, I'm going to need to get this reply URI. Let me copy it in over here. Go do an application registration, new registration. This is going to be a demo ASP.NET Core MVC app. And there we go. And I'm going to enter that URL that I copied. Make sure that is set. Okay, and I'm going to need this application ID that's generated for me right there. Come on back here, paste that in. Okay, now I just need my policy names. So come back to my tenant and custom policies. Let's see, sign up and sign in. Great. Password reset. Copy its name. And profile editing. Go ahead, okay, and create the web application. Okay, so I've got Visual Studio set up and configured. It's gone ahead and built that. If I look at my application settings, the values to work with my Azure AD B2C tenant are in there and ready to go. Yes, so I can go ahead and run this. And I'm going to let this thing get started here. And as it comes up, I'll go ahead and click sign in. Oh no, oops, what happened? Well, we can see in our logging that's being generated by our middleware here, there was a bit of a problem. Unauthorized client, A80 B2C 9057. The application is not configured to allow the implicit flow. Okay, well, let's go back and fix that. If I come back to my tenant and my applications, demo, authentication, we'll go ahead and light up those settings and hit save. Okay, now that'll take a second to set and be available. While that's going there, let me also, I'm going to go ahead and integrate this application with Application Insights. And I'll sign in with my user account. And let it locate the App Insights instances in my subscription. Of course, it's taking a minute. Okay, and there we go. Okay, and I'm going to actually use the same App Insights instance that I used for the telemetry I was gathering inside of the B2C service requests. I'll go ahead and register that with my application, and that's going to go ahead and make bring in a couple of SDKs to my application, and it's also going to update my application settings to include the Application Insights key that we used also earlier on. So there we go. That instrumentation key is set. If I go ahead and hit run here, go ahead and run. Now that we've made the correction on the server, I want to be sure to show you how to go ahead and troubleshoot the requests coming out from my application. Before I hit sign in, I'm going to bring up my developer tools here in the browser, and I'm going to go to the network tab. I'll select preserve the log, clear it out, and I'm going to hit sign in. And we'll see a few interesting things here. Let me resize this. So it made a request to an internal sign-in endpoint. That, in turn, made a request to authorize, and that is our authorization endpoint on our Azure AD B2C tenant. If I go ahead and scroll down here, I can see here are the query string arguments. It's sending a request to the authorized endpoint with my client ID, with this redirect URI. It's requesting an ID token. It's requesting these scopes. It's using a post. It's requesting that the information be posted back when it's done. And again, I can see all the information about the endpoint that's being called. This gives me a ton of information about what's going on. Am I really making the calls that I think I'm making? Did I put the right values in there? Also, with the Application Insights telemetry that I was gathering, if I come on over here, I doubt that it's going to be quite up to date. So I'll just go ahead and look again at the last 4 hours. And I got to choose all events. There we go. And we'll see, I ran one earlier with this additional telemetry enabled. Go ahead and isolate that. And I can see down here, here is my request to the sign-in endpoint. And under it, it's going to make a couple dependency calls to B2C. In particular, it's calling the OpenID configuration endpoint that's part of the OpenID Connect telemetry. Then it's going to go and try and get the encryption key information. And then I'm starting to collect the trace telemetry. And so on and so forth. And it'll go on and continue and gather the additional telemetry that'll make up that particular request. Let me see if I got some more custom events. No, let me come on back here. Whoops, wrong button. If I go to search, that's 30. Let's see if that's caught up with me. I believe it has. But my custom events aren't quite here yet. They'll take a minute to get here. But anyway, you get the general idea that, I now have a nice, good view of what's going on in my application insights as it's being called from my application and what values are being exchanged. Okay, that's all we had time for today. I know that was quite a lot. And also that concludes the series that we've been doing here. So thank you all for having been here. We'd really, really appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to fill out the feedback surveys. And I believe we have a little bit of time left to handle any questions that you may have.
Awesome. On for a session. So I think the questions are coming in. There was one question earlier, I think in the Visual Studio Code, when you were showing us a demo, there was an option for investigate. I don't think I've seen that in B2C extensions. Is that something that you have, another extension? Someone was asking, what's the investigate?
I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with it myself. I'm kind of curious where it was. If you can give me some hints as to where it is, I'll be happy to look it up and try and tell you about it.
Yeah, if if they can post another question, then we can look at that. What else? We don't have very many questions, but we'll give it some time in case there are questions.
In the meantime, I can see if my telemetry is catching up with me here. Trace. Where are my custom events? I'll have to figure out where they've gone to. But yeah, any additional questions? Everybody excited about build tomorrow?
Yeah. No, none at this point. So I guess we can wrap up early then.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I appreciate it. Take some time to fill in the post-event survey. Thank you.
Even if I can add just one quick thing. So this is the end of the series. Thank you for all the support. But if we could possibly have more sessions based on your feedback. If this is helpful, please feel free to reach out to us through the post-session survey, and we can look at adding more topics to this, possibly even office hours. So yeah, let us know. Thank you.